Welcome to Science Matters, a series about new developments in the life sciences. Science Matters is brought to you by the Division of Biology at UCSD and its industry partners, and by the San Diego Foundation's Reuben H. Fleet Foundation Fund, sponsors of the Science Matters website, designed for school teachers and students. Please visit this website and let us know what you think. And now, please enjoy the program.
Robert Fisher is a research zoologist for the USGS Western Ecological Field Station, and he's actually a postdoc, and he's been a postdoc and a project scientist here at UCSD working with Ted Case in his lab. And he's continued that collaboration at UCSD with Ted in a long-term study of amphibians and reptiles that's still going on in Southern California, and on an online field guide, which I have the website for right here if anybody's interested in. It's a pretty neat field guide online, a field guide to the reptiles and amphibians of coastal Southern California. Robert's talk will be on the native San Diego animals that are being lost and why we as stewards of this environment should care. Robert?
So we've been interested in San Diego and reptiles and amphibians here for about 7 years since Ted and I started this project. And I'm going to kind of overview a little bit more about biodiversity, and then I'll focus in on some of the work we've been doing in San Diego, and then kind of put San Diego into a global context for biodiversity. What's been done in the past is that globally there are these places that are identified, that a lot of which are the tropics, that are sites that have lots and lots of endemic species, lots of species diversity, where there's a lot of species that don't occur anywhere else in the world except for those areas. And in the United States, this part of California and Baja California, which in adjacent Mexico, is a biodiversity hotspot. So that means that globally, in the world, there's only 20-some sites, and this is one of them. And it's been estimated that by spending about $6 billion, you can protect the majority of these global biodiversity hotspots that currently exist. But what's interesting is that the research that we've been doing has been focusing on this global biodiversity hotspot and understanding the patterns of species distributions within that hotspot, and then also understanding what are the factors affecting the future of species in this area. And so what are kind of the risk factors for this biodiversity hotspot? So the research we started in '95 was focusing on a series of sites throughout the remaining open lands in Southern California to look at reptiles and amphibians in particular, but then in addition to that, we started looking at small mammals and invertebrates in some areas. And by using a standardized study design, we're able to compare different areas, such as areas in Riverside County or Orange County, to areas in San Diego County, to see how their species diversity and biodiversity are affected by land use decisions, and then also being affected by land use decisions such as where people are going to live, but also by climate and other variables that vary across this region. And so the basic design of our study is we had these reserve or parkland areas that we started with, and then in each of these we had multiple sampling locations. And so at this site in Riverside County, we have a series of places where we're collecting data on reptiles and amphibians. And each of these places looks like this. It's a set of traps, which are 5-gallon buckets and fences and some snake traps. And what happens is animals, reptiles and amphibians and small mammals, will walk through the habitat, find a fence, follow a fence, and then fall in a bucket. And then these are called pitfall traps. And so then when they fall in a pitfall trap, we'll go out there and we'll have field crews that are checking these buckets every day. And then they'll pull out the animals that are in the buckets and kind of see what species they are, weigh and measure them, and then mark them, and then release them back in the same habitat. But by having a series of sampling locations within a parkland habitat, and then having many parkland habitats, we can get an idea of how these animals are viewing this landscape. And like I said, this landscape changes. You can see here, this area is this is a satellite photo, and then this area is a lot more dry than these mountain areas. And you see that a lot of these habitat patches around San Diego, such as Point Loma and some of these other Torrey pines, are isolated by all this gray, which is houses and urbanization. So we can kind of understand how these patterns of species distributions are changing through different, like I said, climatic and then urbanization gradients. And so we started the study in '95, and we had 30 of these sites, and then we have over 400 of these arrays, and then which is equivalent to over 3,000 of these buckets, and 1,200 of these snake traps that are along 3 per array, and then 22 kilometers of fences that we established. And then we had, like I said, these field crews going out on bi-monthly intervals, checking each set of traps. And so they've looked in the equivalent of 600,000 bucket nights and 300,000 snake traps. And so a lot of the data that Ted and I have accumulated over the last 7 years has been from this study, and looking at these patterns both across space, or across this region, and across time over these different years when we've had wet years and dry years, looking at how those different species abundances have changed over those periods of time. So one thing we can do by using these standard sampling arrays is we can do these we have this comparable sampling across the region. And so we found 46 species of reptiles and amphibians that represent 18 families. And we've got over 60,000 captures of reptiles and amphibians from across this area. And then each of those 30 study sites might have between 9 and 33 species present. And then one of these array sampling points might have up to 22 species present. And so that single point over that period of years might have up to 22 species of both reptiles and amphibians present at that point. So we're getting an understanding of how these animals are then using their landscapes, using this both local landscape within a park and then across parks. And then once we can take this data, we can visualize how different species are viewing this regional landscape, this Southern California area. And so what we've done is we've taken our species abundance data for these different points. These are the sampling points that I showed you earlier on the satellite image. And then by taking these sampling points and the abundance for different species at each of these points, we can then see what types of regional areas they prefer. And so these are 2 different species. This is the horned lizard, which is here, and then this is the fence lizard, which I'll show you a little later. And the horned lizard prefers these areas in southern San Diego County and on some sand dunes down here, but it doesn't like some of these areas up against some of the more urbanized LA Basin areas. And so it's like some other interior areas in San Diego and in Riverside County, whereas the fence lizard really doesn't like this dry area in Riverside that I showed you that's very, very dry on the satellite image, and it likes a lot of these more coastal zones where it's more mesic and more wet. And so you can see that these 2 species, even though they both occur at a lot of the same study sites, have very different abundances based on both kind of regional patterns and then also due to human affected areas. Like the horned lizard is missing from this coastal area of San Diego, which is primarily probably due to where people live now. And then one of the things we've done with this large data set is we can start looking at declines in species due to fragmentation and kind of, like I said, current land use patterns, where people live, where agriculture is, versus where these parkland natural habitats are. And so on this figure, what we're able to do is we're able to recreate what the snake communities were 80 years ago. So we're able to get historic records, and then for a variety of study sites across San Diego County, we're able to build up a list of snakes that were there previously. And these blocks that are crossbarred were presence of snakes as we found from museum records, mostly collected by one fella named Lawrence Klauber between the 1920s and the 1940s. And he collected a lot of data for snakes throughout San Diego County. And so by using his data, we can then, like I said, recreate what snakes might have been at these park areas in the past. And then these solid blocks are places that Ted and I have recorded current day presence of these snakes at these same areas. And what you can see is these areas in green are more intact, larger natural lands, and these areas in red are more isolated fragments of habitat that are left, like Point Loma, where you've got a tiny peninsula with very little habitat left. And when you compare these two, you see that there's a lot of snakes we couldn't reconfirm, we couldn't find in the last 7 years at these study sites, whereas at these larger blocks, we have most of the snakes that were previously recorded there. And so we're getting at patterns of decline, and we have a series of snakes that we're finding are missing from a lot of different study areas. And so what we can try to do is then figure out, well, since we know that they were there in the past, and they don't appear to be there now, what are the hypotheses that are causing their extinctions? And kind of two possible hypotheses for snakes. And one includes the impacts of roads, and the other is impacts of potential light pollution. There's also patterns of decline for certain lizards, such as the horned lizard, that has other hypotheses, such as the invasion of Argentine ants for its decline. But let's look at snakes for a second. So we have these two hypotheses. One is that there's been this change in risk factors for biodiversity over time. And like I said, this impact of roads and vehicles on roads is one we can look at with this graph, where we have 1938 and the amount of traffic in San Diego County at that point in time versus the amount of traffic in 1995 when we started our study versus the amount of traffic in San Diego that's projected in another 13 years. And we can see that over time, as more people move into San Diego, more vehicles are purchased, the increase in traffic really goes up. And snakes in particular are very sensitive to increases in traffic because they'll crawl across roads, whereas a lot of birds will fly over roads, and so they're less impacted by people driving around and within parks. And so we think that this is an increase in risk that may be affecting what snakes occur where now throughout Southern California. And there was some math or statistics done on this at this point on snake deaths in San Diego due to roads. And it was estimated that in 1938 there was about 10,000 snakes being killed per year in roads in San Diego. And so if there was only 2 million car miles being driven per day and 10,000 dead snakes per year, if we project it to here, which we can't directly project it, but obviously there'd be a much larger impact on snakes now than there was in the past. Another change in risk factor is looking at urban light pollution. Some snakes are nocturnal, so they're only active during at night. And a lot of their prey are nocturnal. A lot of small mammals are nocturnal, so they're not out at all during the day, but only out at night. So a lot of animals then are following a lunar cycle. They're active when there's no moon, but they're not active when there's a full moon, because when there's a full moon, owls and cats and other things can see you, and so it's easier to get, you're more at risk of being eaten when there's a full moon. And so if we look at what we've done to the sky at night, this is a picture from Mount Wilson in 1908 of Los Angeles and how bright Los Angeles was in 1908. And then this is the same picture in 1988. And so over 80 years, you can see the difference in how much light we're producing at night across this Los Angeles basin landscape. And so if you're an animal that needs darkness at night, there's almost no place you can find darkness in this landscape now. And so this is the same type of things we see for San Diego and other areas. And so one idea is that a lot of these nocturnal species now are incapable of persisting in these areas where you've got so much light at night as a risk factor. With regards to biodiversity, when we started our studies in 1995, a lot of snakes, such as this one, this is the red racer, which is one of the snakes that we're finding is declining across a lot of our study sites. It was thought to be one species, one type across all of California. And so we've got a graduate student that's been looking at the genetics of the species and been studying them across the genetics across California, what he's finding is it looks like there's actually maybe 5 different kinds of red racers in California. So then if we're protecting parks and trying to protect these snakes within parks, they're not all the same, so that at different places in Southern California, there's different red racers. And so what we're finding is that in the Los Angeles Basin area, there's one kind of red racer that's different from the one that's in southern San Diego, which is different from the one that's in kind of northern San Diego. And so there's a variety, even for species that we think we're protecting, like because they occur at several different park areas, there's differences across these parks that we need to make sure we capture as we're protecting this biodiversity. The other thing is that we don't know how many species we actually have. So if we look at the area of Southern California, and we know that globally it's important for biodiversity. We're trying to protect biodiversity here. We also need to protect biodiversity, but we have to understand what biodiversity exists. And so this is a rock bass that was unknown to science until 1999 when it was described. And it was discovered off the coast of La Jolla, off of Scripps Pear, in 1995. And so this species was unknown to science until just a couple years ago. And so if we're going to be protecting species, we have to kind of know that they exist to some extent, or we have to protect landscapes so that they're functioning properly, so that species that we don't know exist can persist in these landscapes even though they're undescribed. And this fish is an interesting example because lots of people have studied fishes off of Scripps for a long time, yet just a couple years ago they discovered this species. And even more surprising is this new shark that was discovered off of Hawaii in 1976. And this is a giant shark. This is called the megamouth shark. And it was first discovered off of Hawaii. And then since then, there's been several found off of California, off the coast of California. And so here's a giant shark that doesn't even have teeth. It's called a megamouth shark. But it went undiscovered, even off the coast of California, for a really long time. And so there might even be these large animals we don't know about that we want to try to protect as we're protecting these parkland habitats and other areas where we have high areas of biodiversity. In some of the work that we've done with these pitfall traps, we found many what are apparently undescribed and a lot of unstudied species that may go extinct right locally, right at Torrey Pines or other parks locally. One of these species is this thing called a silk spinning cricket. And this cricket actually builds burrows in soft sand, and it spins silk to line its burrows. And this thing was unknown from San Diego County until we started our work in 1995. And we're working with an expert on this species and then these Jerusalem crickets as well, that's showing us that a lot of these species are unknown to science per se. People have seen them in the past, but they're not named, and they haven't been described. And what's pretty amazing is that these bugs, this Jerusalem cricket in particular, one of the species is the largest terrestrial insect in Southern California, yet largest by size, but it has never been named, so it's undescribed still. And then one of the things that's important is understanding the value, the cost value of biodiversity to society. And so we can talk about we need to save species, and species are important, and we have this biodiversity hotspot, and it might cost $6 billion to protect all these hotspots in the globe. And if we look at this one species of lizard, which is one that I talked about a little bit earlier, which is the western fence lizard, this species itself is doing a great service to us locally. And there's this disease called the Lyme disease, and it's estimated by this professor from New York University that Lyme disease costs society about $1 billion per year. That's the cost of this disease every year. And this lizard has these ticks that actually carry Lyme disease. And what happens on the east coast of the United States, there isn't an equivalent lizard, and these ticks go to mice or to birds, and then they go to humans, and then humans get this Lyme disease from these ticks. But in California, where we have these lizards, these fence lizards, these ticks go to these lizards and then maybe go to humans. And what these lizards do is they play this very important ecological function where they have a compound in their blood that kills this disease, this Lyme disease spirochete. And this is what Lyme disease looks like. This is Borrelia. And actually, so when these ticks get on these lizards and suck the blood, it kills these spirochetes. And so then before they get to us, we don't get the disease. So this Lyme disease is also a new species, basically. It was discovered in 1982. And it was thought that there was only one kind of Lyme disease in 1982. And since then, there's about 100 types of Lyme disease known now from the United States, and about 300 types known from the worldwide. And as you can see, in this graph shows 1982 to almost the present, and shows the number of cases reported of Lyme disease in the United States over time. And as more and more people are educated about Lyme disease, more and more cases are discovered that are really from Lyme disease. But if you look at where it occurs in the country, what we see is that there's been less than 200,000 cases reported since 1982, and the majority of those cases are in New York, and the majority of them overall are on the East Coast. California, which has lots of people, has 30 million people, has only had less than 3,000 cases of Lyme disease reported in the last 20 years. And so what's interesting is because we have these lizards, and these lizards occur throughout this area. This is where Lyme disease could occur within the country, but since these fence lizards occur throughout this area, they're playing this very important ecological function in protecting us from this disease that could cost us a lot more money with regards to health care costs. And it's estimated that there's actually, this number is much greater. It's actually estimated that there's 1.5 to 2 million cases of Lyme disease in the United States, but that very few of them are reported because a lot of doctors are still learning about this disease. So what's interesting is that here's a lizard that seems to be doing pretty well based on our research, yet it's playing this really important ecological function that if we didn't have this lizard and maybe other elements of biodiversity locally, we don't know what other types of costs we would incur as society to losing those biodiversity elements, those pieces of biodiversity. And again, when it ties back to Jerusalem crickets and other things that are undescribed, we have no idea what ecological roles they're playing. So right now, kind of a summary is that we have biodiversity right now is currently at risk here now in San Diego, because of the way we're building houses and such. And then there's many unknown species that are waiting for discovery. And then there's a variety of values to humans and society from this biodiversity, both the biodiversity we know about and potentially the biodiversity we don't know about. And I'll just end with that. Thanks. So this is one of the rare snakes that we're finding locally. There's a couple of different snakes I was going to try to bring. This is a garter snake from the San Bernardino Mountains, and they only occur in Southern California in the San Bernardino Mountains near LA, and they used to be very widespread. And in the beginning of the century, there was anybody that went up there collected 10 or 20 or 30 a day, and we've been looking for these things for the last 5 or 6 years, and we finally found this one. This is the only one we've seen, and we found it at a new location. But what we think is going on is that these snakes feed on frogs, one kind of frog in particular, the mountain yellow-legged frog. And the mountain yellow-legged frog in Southern California is almost extinct. So what we think's happened is that as the food has disappeared for this snake, these snakes have gone locally extinct, and because there's nothing for them to eat. And we're not sure exactly why the frogs are going extinct. We think that there's a lot of more trout now in these mountains than there was in the past, because Fish and Game has stocked trout, and so we think that's causing the trout are eating the frogs, and then the frogs are going extinct, and then the snakes don't have food because they're not eating the trout, and so then they're disappearing. So we have a couple of rare snakes around the lab, and the other snake I was going to bring was a glossy snake, but it's was shedding right now, and so I didn't bring that one. But this one's interesting because, like I said, it's locally very rare, and there's a professor up in Oregon that's doing genetics on these things, and it looks like these ones from the San Bernardino Mountains might be distinct and unique compared to the rest of these terrestrial garter snakes from elsewhere. So it's an interesting one because it's not very common at all, but it's declining for a different, potentially, set of reasons than some of the things that we've been studying at these lower elevations. So it's more of a high elevation species. I brought a Jerusalem cricket. This is one of these, a live one of these large undescribed guys. And this is kind of a juvenile. It's not the biggest one we've seen, but anyway, I brought it so people could look at it. And what's interesting with these, there's some larger ones that I had brought that are preserved. And it's hard to keep the large ones alive because what happens is they develop horsehair worms. They have a parasite that lives inside of them. And it's a very long, thin worm. And it makes them, in the spring, it makes them want to go to water. It makes them hydrophilic. And so it drives these insects to water. And then when they get to water, into a creek or something, they jump in the water. And then out of their rear end comes this giant worm. And then basically the cricket dies, and then this worm swims around in the water for several weeks and lays eggs in the water. And then its eggs are drank by coyotes or foxes and stuff. And so it's hard to keep large ones alive because they often have a mature worm inside, and they want to go drink so that the worm can get out. And so I have a few of them that are preserved, but I just wanted to bring one live one because this group in particular is a group that we're interested in because there is a lot of apparently genetic diversity as well as morphological diversity. And there was only one species for a long time, only one species known from the whole state of California, and it looks like now there's maybe 20 or 30 different species. Yeah.
Does the worm hurt the animals that drink the eggs?
What I think it does is they don't drink the worm per se, but they drink its eggs, and then the eggs develop inside the animal that drinks it. And so inside a coyote or a fox, the worms develop inside them, and then when they go to the bathroom, when they defecate in the forest, the worms get into the soil, and then these bugs, these crickets, will eat the soil, and they'll get the worms, and then the worms develop in the crickets. And so there's different intermediate hosts, but the cricket is the one that the full worm develops in. Okay. And so it's very interesting because since there's a lot of undescribed crickets, there may be a lot of undescribed worms that are living inside different crickets. And then if the crickets were to go to extinct, the worm might go to extinct as well because then you're breaking this cycle. Okay. Or if you lose coyotes, then you might be breaking the cycle as well. Well, and that was the point of this talk, which was part of this meeting that we had, I guess, a month ago about understanding the value to biodiversity. And so this company, Diversa, is actually doing that, where they're biodiversity prospecting, and they're looking to see how much value is in different types of organisms. And I think that, I guess the point I was trying to make is that we don't even know. And so here's just one example I can pull out where you can tie the pieces together and say, look, this lizard's maybe saving however many millions of dollars or $1 billion in health costs in California per year, but and there may be a whole series of other taxa that we don't know about yet that are doing similar things. I think that there's more money being put into trying to figure out pharmaceutical uses of different animals as opposed to what their societal use is. Those are kind of two different things, and so a lot of people aren't prospecting to see how good different organisms are per se, but is there something we can extract from that organism? And I think those are a little different.
Well, thanks again, Robert.